Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a knight or a damsel or even a jolly ale-swigging bard, but with a man who stood quietly behind all three when their heads needed to roll, the medieval executioner. Yes, you've probably seen him in movies, big hood, huge axe, dramatic thunk, but trust me, real medieval executioners were about as glamorous as an unpaid dentist with social cooties and a side hustle nobody wanted to talk about. So before you lean back into your pillow fortress and drift off, do me a favor. Like this video only if you actually want more weird sleepy history, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It still blows my mind how many of you listen to this while pretending to work from home or while your cat walks on your keyboard. Alright, lights low, fan humming, blanket tucked up to your chin. Good. Now picture this. You weren't born swinging an axe for the king's dirty work. No village midwife slapped your newborn backside and said, "Ah, behold, the future bringer of short necks and long silences at parties." Nope. More likely you grew up as the butcher's kid or the tanner's apprentice. Jobs already disgusting enough that when a local lord needed a new executioner, the villagers said, "Hey, that guy's already covered in blood half the time anyway." In some towns, the job was even hereditary. Congratulations. Dad split heads for coin, Grandpa swung before him, and now it's your turn. Family legacy, medieval style. Contrary to every dramatic movie you've seen, you didn't wear black leather armor and glare menacingly at the hero. Most executioners wore plain work clothes, sturdy boots, a rough tunic, a hood if they were lucky, because anonymity helped when your neighbours spat near your doorstep. See? People needed you. They just didn't want to invite you over for stew. You were both feared and useful. Villagers avoided your eyes at the market. The priest mumbled extra prayers when you turned up at church. If you tried to sit at the tavern, the stool next to you stayed suspiciously empty. But hey, you had a roof over your head. A lot of medieval folks didn't. And your wages, usually better than a farmhand's. Hazard pay for all the, well, hazards. Execution day started early. You didn't get a warm-up routine or a pep talk from your manager. You sharpened your blade in the dark, muttering little prayers under your breath. Your tools were simple but vital. A good solid block, your trusty axe or sword, maybe a rope if you were doing a hanging instead. Oh, and a bucket, for you know, heads. Medieval town squares were messy places. A good executioner was prized for efficiency. One clean strike, people clapped. 2 strikes, they winced. 3 strikes, you'd best find a new village before the tomatoes flew. In England, beheadings were considered a mark of noble status. So if you were a noble criminal, congratulations. You got the axe, not the rope. And you might even bribe your executioner to really make sure they didn't miss and turn your neck into a log being whittled at by a toddler with a butter knife. It was called the executioner's fee. So yes, tipping culture, alive and well in medieval capital punishment. When you weren't lopping off heads, you were still busy. Executioners doubled as torturers, jailers, and sometimes even knackers, the folks who disposed of dead animals. Medieval towns didn't waste a good strong arm. Need someone to cut off a thief's ear or brand a forehead with a hot iron. You, my friend, were the man for the job. You also got first dibs on the condemned's clothes and personal belongings, perks of the profession, though they did little to improve your social calendar. It's hard to woo a nice peasant girl when you reek of burning flesh and rumours that you chat with ghosts at night. Speaking of romance, your love life. Not great. Most folk wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pike. If you married, it was often to a widow who needed a breadwinner more than a cuddle buddy. Children, if you had them, they often grew up wearing the same hood you did. Lucky them. You couldn't quit easily either. Once marked as an executioner, you carried that social stain for life. Some families ended up founding whole bloodlines of state-sanctioned killers because, honestly, what else could they do? Medieval career counselling wasn't exactly a thing. They said spirits haunted the scaffold. They said a cursed blade might sing at night, whispering the names of the wrongly condemned. Did you believe it? Maybe. Hard not to, when you couldn't sleep and the wind rattled your cottage shutters like knuckles tapping, tapping, tapping. You prayed more than you boasted. You drank when prayer didn't work. And you showed up every time the bailiff knocked on your door at dawn. Because whatever else you were reliable. So you think you just woke up one fine medieval morning, grabbed an axe and joined the royal payroll. Not quite. Becoming an executioner was more like slipping into quicksand. Slow, sticky, and once you were in, you didn't crawl back out. You began, like so many poor boys with unfortunate last names, as an assistant to an older, meaner man who already wore the hood and knew how to swing without trembling. You were 12 the first time you stood in the shadow of the block. Your master, a man called Old Joran. Old, because no one knew his age, only that he'd outlasted 3 mayors and a bishop who once tried to have him hanged for gambling away the town's tax silver. Shoved a rough broom into your hands and barked, "Keep the flies off the heads, boy, or I'll have you on this block myself." Not exactly a warm welcome to the family business. Your first lessons were simple. How to clean dried blood off wood before the sun baked it in for good. How to carry a severed head with both hands so it didn't flop unceremoniously into the dirt. Because crowds hated a sloppy show. How to keep your mouth shut when the condemned cursed your entire bloodline right up to your grandmother's cat. They called you Joran's whelp at the tavern. Not that you could afford to drink there yet. Your pay was mostly stale bread and a bed in Joran's loft, right above his pigs. Warm in winter, stinking in summer, and always alive with rats big enough to chew your toes if you didn't tuck your blanket tight. By 14, you knew more about human fear than any priest in the village. You saw what men did when the rope coiled near their neck or the axe loomed above them. Big, swaggering thieves turned to whimpering children. Stoic traitors spat poetry until their final breath. Once, a noblewoman called you "darling boy," as if that could change her fate. At night, you lay on the loft floor, listening to Joran snore like a thunderstorm and the pigs grunt below. You stared at the timber beams and wondered, how did I end up here? Your mother had died birthing your sister, who died soon after. Your father drank himself into debt with every alehouse from your village to the next shire over. When the bailiff dragged him away, your choice was the workhouse or Joran's forge, which was less a forge and more a rough shed with blades hanging on pegs like hungry mouths waiting to bite. Joran taught you more than just swinging steel. He taught you to gamble, poorly. He taught you how to haggle with bailiffs for your rightful share of the execution fee. Never let him say the king's silver is all you get, boy. The condemned has a purse too, and he can't take it with him. He taught you to sharpen an axe, so keen it would slice parchment before it ever tasted flesh. To pack clean straw under the block so blood wouldn't pool and stink up the square for days after. To time your swing with the hush, that perfect heartbeat of silence when the crowd's breath caught and everyone thought, could I stand there kneeling, my neck bare? One crisp spring dawn, Joran nudged you awake with a boot to your ribs. "Today's the day, whelp," he grunted, scratching his beard with a yellowed thumb. "You hold the axe, I watch." Your hands went clammy before you even sat up. Your breakfast, half a boiled egg and stale bread, turned to lead in your throat. You wiped the axe's blade until you could see your shaking reflection. A pale boy's face framed by a hood a size too big. The scaffold smelled of rain-soaked wood and old secrets. The crowd smelled of turnips and cheap beer, pressed close, eyes wide. Your knees ached on the platform's rough planks. At your feet knelt a cattle thief, young enough to be your brother. Dirty hair stuck to his forehead, eyes darting like a trapped hare's. Joran didn't say good luck. He only tapped your shoulder with a calloused finger and stepped back. You raised the axe. Heavy, awkward, your arms trembling. For a breathless second you thought, what if I just run? You didn't, because there was nowhere to run, not for boys like you. Your first swing landed true enough, not elegant, not legendary, but clean enough that no one booed, and the priest nodded, and Joran slapped your back that night and growled, "Not bad, whelp. Next time, lift your elbows." You cleaned the blade by moonlight behind Joran's pig shed. The blood didn't bother you as much as the silence. Inside your head, you could still see the boy's eyes, open, surprised, forever. You wondered if you'd dream about him. You did. You would dream of all of them. But you also dreamt of coin in your pocket, bread on your plate, maybe a cloak that didn't smell of pig manure and other men's last breaths. Dream small, dream true. That's how an apprentice executioner survived long enough to one day earn his own hood. You'd think that after your first clean swing, you'd become iron-nerved overnight, a master of the block with a blade that never quivered. But that's the pretty lie townsfolk like to tell themselves. The executioner fears nothing. His axe never trembles. His hand is steady as St. George's sword. In truth, you slept like a stone for 3 nights after your first execution. Exhaustion and terror wrapped tight together. Then you woke in the dark on the 4th night, sweat-slick and gasping, because you dreamed of the cattle thief's eyes again. Eyes that had begged you silently, right until the hush before the swing. You whispered your prayers to saints that never seemed to listen to boys like you. You oiled your blade every dusk. You practiced your swing on a log behind your Joran's pig shed until your shoulders burned and your palms blistered raw, skin peeling like onions. Better to blister now, you told yourself, than to shame yourself when it truly counts. A month passed. 2 more simple jobs. Both small-time pickpockets, both swings true enough that even Joran only grunted mild approval instead of growling new insults. You felt taller. Your hood no longer slipped over your eyes when you bent your head. You caught yourself walking straighter through the market, though folks still crossed the street to avoid the brush of your cursed sleeves. Then came the Lord's cousin. Not a bread thief, not a pickpocket, a real noble blood, accused of conspiring to poison a hunting dog that happened to belong to a baron's spoiled brat's son. The gossips argued endlessly about whether the dog even existed. But the law needed a show, and you, Joran's whelp, were the showman. The morning of the execution dawned mean and grey. Clouds sagged low enough to brush the rooftops. The scaffold's timbers groaned under your boots, damp from a night's rain that hadn't yet given up. You checked your blade 3 times, turning it against the pale light, hoping the drizzle would wash away the smell of wet wood and fear. Your noble prisoner was a slip of a man in fine hose, now stained with mud from the jail. He wept when the priest mumbled final blessings. His weeping turned to dry sobs when they pushed him to kneel. The hush spread through the crowd like a rumour. Wide eyes, bated breath, the same silent question on every mouth. Will the boy do it clean? Or will he fumble? You raised your axe. Your arms were strong. Your mind was a hornet's nest, steady, steady, just like the log. One swing, neat, clean. Your palms slicked with sweat you couldn't stop. You inhaled. You swung. It landed wrong. The edge struck too high on the neck, clipping bone instead of slicing clean. A horrible crack. Not the crisp thock you'd prayed for. The crowd gasped. A few women shrieked. The noble's body convulsed, blood spraying the fresh straw in a sudden red mist. Your knees locked. Time stumbled. You saw Joran's ghost of a grin from the edge of the scaffold. Well, lad, there's your test. You swung again. Fast, desperate, more rage than precision. Another sick crack. The noble's head finally broke free, rolling half a foot before toppling into the bucket you'd placed so carefully. The hush turned sour. No applause. Only mutters, muffled retching. the priest crossing himself 3 times as if you'd summoned a demon instead of delivering a soul to heaven. Somewhere in the crowd, someone spat at the plank near your boots. You spent that night alone in the loft, turning your axe over and over in your lap. You scrubbed the blade with sand until your fingernails split and the steel gleamed in the moonlight, cold and mocking. Joran never came up the ladder to scold you, which was worse than any blow or barked insult. His silence weighed more than the axe itself. The next morning, you found him at the pig trough, drinking cheap ale straight from a battered horn. "Bad swing, boy," he said, not looking at you. "Bad swing, but you didn't run, and you finished. Next time you won't shake so much." You wanted to tell him you didn't shake, that the clouds shifted wrong, that the prisoner flinched, that the block was damp. All excuses, and you knew it. So instead you just nodded. You thought about burying the axe behind the shed, packing a sack, and vanishing into the woods. But where would you go? Who would hire you, this cursed boy with blood on his boots, and fear stitched into his spine? So you stayed. You swung again the next week, a farmhand who'd stabbed his master in a drunken quarrel over a girl neither truly loved. This time your swing was perfect. Crisp, clean, no flinch, no slip. The crowd murmured praise again, but quieter now, wary after the last spectacle. You learned fast. The block was your stage, your confessional, your final exam every time. And no one forgave a failing mark. A botched swing turned your name to a curse on gossiping tongues. It turned the baker's eyes away when you asked for a fresh loaf on credit. It turned your dreams sour, revisiting the noble's pale neck, the crunch of bone, the hiss of the crowd. And yet, the coin still found your purse. The church still looked the other way when you dragged your sins to confession. And every lord who needed fear to keep order still needed you to sharpen your blade and stand behind the trembling necks of men and women who'd angered the wrong man, the wrong priest, the wrong crown. You were not a hero. You were not a villain either. You were the hand that made laws real, iron and blood instead of parchment and ink. You learned the difference between mercy and hesitation, between pity and ruin. And when your hood dropped low over your eyes, the crowd forgot your name, but never forgot your work. The next swing, and the next, and the next. Clean, steady, precise. You never botched again. By now you'd earned your place behind the block. Boy no longer, hooded figure always. Your swing was trusted, your blade feared, and even Joran, now grey and stooped, stopped calling you whelp and instead called you master executioner when sober enough to remember. But the higher your axe swung, the more coin and whispers found their way to your doorstep. Because where there is death, there is always desperation. And desperation is the best customer a man like you could have. It began small. A pickpocket's mother once pressed a silver penny into your palm while you bought onions in the market. "Mercy, good sir," she hissed, eyes flicking nervously at the fishmonger, who pretended not to listen. You wanted to laugh. Mercy. From an executioner. What did she think you would do? Swing softer. You kept her coin. You needed it more than she did. Harsh, but true. The pickpocket lost his head anyway. But the stakes grew higher when you moved up from village thieves to men whose names dripped with titles longer than your whole family tree. The crown demanded your blade for traitors and conspirators, real or invented, and every noble fool who crossed the wrong lord at the wrong feast. That's when the bribes got serious. A baron's nephew, wrists bound in fine silk rope, rather than hemp like a common thief, sat in your cell once. Young, soft hands, eyes watery from too much wine, and too little backbone. The bailiff left. The guards snored outside the door. The boy leaned forward on the bench, heavy gold signet ring gleaming in the torchlight. His voice shook more than yours did on your first swing. "Executioner. No one ever used your given name. You're a man of the world, yes? We both know the Crown's evidence is horse dung. Let me go. My uncle will pay you double what your filthy salary offers. You studied him. Velvet sleeves, pearl buttons, lips trembling behind a bravado thin as parchment. He'd never killed a rat in his kitchen, yet here he sat, begging you to spare him from the blade meant for his betters. You didn't answer him then, just watched him squirm like a trout on a hook. That night, in your shack near the churchyard, because they wouldn't let you live inside the walls anymore, not with the stain on your soul, you laid out the Baron's pouch on your splintered table. Heavy, warm, smelling faintly of lavender and desperation. You could vanish with this. New clothes, a horse, maybe a life where no one whispered butcher behind your back. Then you pictured the bailiff's fat face when he found the cell empty. The Lord Steward standing at your door with the king's seal and a noose instead of a coin purse. You knew too well how to tie a knot tight enough to end a man's begging. So you did what you always did. You chose survival. At dawn, the Baron's nephew climbed the scaffold in silk slippers, teeth chattering so violently you half wondered if his head would just pop off from fright alone. You swung quick, clean, like a mercy. The pouch stayed buried beneath your floorboards for months until you dared spend it, coin by coin, pretending it was honest wages. Not every bribe ended the same. Some you pocketed because fools paid more for false hope than you ever earned for certainty. Some you refused outright because the Crown's eyes watched too closely. And some you took because you knew better than to cross certain bloodlines twice. A merchant once offered you a silver crucifix to loosen the rope before dawn so his son might slip free under the cover of moonlight. You still wore that crucifix around your neck when the boy swung anyway. Not because you kept the bribe, but because you pitied the merchant's tears. Your own father had once wept that same way, begging for debt forgiveness. No one forgave him. In the end, every bribe was just more proof you weren't justice. You were the knife justice used, and knives don't decide who they cut. They just keep their edge sharp. You never bragged. You never confessed. You spent the coins carefully. A new cloak here, a better whetstone there. Enough comfort to sleep with ghosts snoring beside you. You learned the oldest rule of all. The axe swings for the crown, not the coin. But if a fool leaves gold in your pocket, well, what's one more secret buried deeper than the bodies you send below the block? By now, your swing was so steady that people whispered you were made of iron. They never saw your hands tremble after the crowd turned away, never heard your soft prayers whispered through cracked lips as you scraped dried blood from your blade under moonlight. But one thing they all knew: the hood. Black or brown, rough wool or sturdy leather in winter. You never worked without it. Some said it was for modesty. Some said it protected your soul from being seen by the devil's own eyes when you sent a sinner his way. Others claimed it was for their comfort, not yours, so that when they saw you haggling for apples at market, they could pretend the butcher was just a butcher, not the shadow who split bones for a living. The truth? The hood hid more than your face. It hid your fear. It hid your disgust at the sights and smells no one else wanted to know. It hid the soft part of you that still flinched when a mother screamed for her son beneath your scaffold. Inside the hood, the world narrowed to a rectangle. Timber planks under your boots, the back of a kneeling neck, and your own breath, damp, stale, reminding you were still human, even when your work was not. You learned to read a man's final secrets through that narrow slit, the twitch of a shoulder, the shallow gasp, the way a condemned traitor might suddenly pray to every saint he'd mocked at court. Some hardened killers wept like babes, some saints spat filth and lies until their last heartbeat. You kept these secrets because you had no choice. Who would you tell? Joran had carried his to the grave, and now you carried his and yours both. You tried once to confess them to the priest. He listened behind the confessional screen until your voice cracked describing the weeping children, the traitor's last pleas. He coughed, blessed you, and told you to light candles for the souls you'd sent ahead. As if beeswax and whispered Hail Marys could clean a blade that never stayed clean for long. The candles flickered out long before your guilt did. And so the secrets rotted sweetly under your hood, like fruit left in the sun too long. At night, lying on your straw pallet beside your whetstone and coin pouch, they came out to play. The merchant's son who swore he was innocent, the baroness who asked you to tell her daughter she was sorry, as if you'd ever find that child in a village 3 days' ride away. The petty thief who begged for one more sip of ale, and you gave it to him from your own flask because, why not? What was another mercy in a job built on none? Sometimes you dreamed the hood slipped. You stood on the scaffold bare-faced, your eyes locked with every man, woman and child in the crowd. They didn't scream. They didn't run. They laughed, pointing at the hangman with no mask, naked as any other sinner. In those dreams, you woke up sweating, your throat dry from shouting things you'd never admit while awake. But come dawn, you rose. You pulled on your work boots, shrugged into the hood as naturally as another man might wear a cap. You checked the blade's edge, felt its balance in your palm, and climbed the creaking steps to the scaffold. Behind the hood, you were the executioner, a rumour, a shadow, a story parents told their brats to keep them honest. Without it, you were just a man who knew far too much about how a neck gives way under steel. And for your sins, and your secrets, the hood forgave you nothing, but it did protect you. Enough. Not every neck you claimed belonged to a monster. That's a truth the ballads never sing, and the town crier never bellows in the square. If you wanted to sleep easily, and most nights you did try, you told yourself your blade served justice, not politics, not greed, not vengeance. But in the quiet hours between sharpening your axe and scrubbing blood from your tunic sleeves, you knew better. Sometimes you ended monsters. Sometimes you ended scapegoats. And sometimes you ended the wrong man entirely, because the right man was rich enough or ruthless enough to vanish into the forest until the crown stopped caring. Your first truly innocent soul came when you just stopped being the boy behind Joran's shoulder and become the man standing alone on the scaffold. It was early winter, a cold that cracked the cartwheels and left frost hanging off your beard like powdered sugar. They dragged him to you at dawn, a farm lad, maybe 16, big eyes, the smell of hay still clinging to him under the stink of the jail. He'd been caught near a merchant's stable after the horse had gone missing. They needed someone to blame before the town's lord came back from campaign and noticed his prize gelding gone. His mother followed him up the scaffold stairs, weeping so hard she nearly slipped on the ice. The bailiff shoved her back into the crowd with all the mercy of a stone wall. You stood there, feeling the weight of your axe handle against your palms. It never felt heavier. When you lifted the blade that morning, you wanted, truly, desperately wanted, to miss. To drop it in the snow. To step aside and say, "Find the real thief, you bloated, gossip-drunk fools." But that's not how the scaffold worked. If the people smelled weakness, if the magistrate smelled defiance, it would be your neck in the snow tomorrow, not his. So you swung. His mother's wail tore through the air like a wild animal trapped inside church walls. That night, you dreamed you were a child again, back in Joran's loft. But the pigs below spoke in the farm boy's voice, asking you why. After that, you got good, too good maybe, at deciding which ghosts to keep and which to bury. Some criminals deserved your steel, the killer who bragged at the tavern about gutting a shepherd for 3 silver coins, the mercenary who burned 3 cottages and bragged louder about that. You liked swinging for those. Justice felt possible then, even if it was ugly. But then, There were the wives accused by jealous husbands, the farmhands blamed for stolen eggs because the real thief wore silk, the boys who ran errands for petty pickpockets and were caught holding the purse. Each innocent you felled added a notch inside you, not on your axe but on your ribs, where no oil or whetstone could ever clean it smooth. You learned tricks to sleep, ale first, heavy and warm on the belly, a candle by the bedside to chase away the shapes that hovered in your dark corners. Some nights you even borrowed a girl from the tavern, not for warmth, not really for pleasure, but for a living heartbeat beside yours. To remind yourself you were still a man, not just a hood. But the guilt never left, not really. Even when the village children scattered at the sight of your boots in the mud, even when the town elders bowed low and slipped you coin to keep order, they called it, when really they meant, keep fear alive. One spring, a preacher from a far-off city arrived, full of fine words and holy fire. He railed against sinners, drank more wine than sense allowed, and pointed his fat ringed finger at you during Mass, called you a necessary evil, a servant of the pit. You thought of telling him you didn't need sermons to know that truth, that the innocent haunted you more fiercely than the guilty ever could. Instead, you simply nodded, dipped your head low, and let him pray over you as if you were a broken dog that might still be saved. But for every soul who called you butcher, there was a soul who slept safely behind their shutters because of you. The farmer's daughter spared the wandering cutthroat you'd caught and sent to the gallows. The merchant's cart's safe on the road because the local ruffians knew your axe didn't forgive a second chance. It was a rough comfort, a balance weighed on a scale no priest could bless. And every time you laid your head on your straw pillow, the same question pressed against your skull. Did I swing for justice today, or for convenience? Some days the answer let you sleep. Some days it didn't. Once, on a sunless market morning, a slip of a girl, dirty feet, hair tangled to her shoulders, tugged your cloak while you haggled for barley bread. She asked if you were the man who'd put down the monster that had murdered her father. You nodded because it was true. The monster had worn a man's face, but confessed before the swing. She didn't say thank you. She just looked at you, half afraid, half relieved, as if she saw both sides of your soul, the ghost keeper and the ghost maker. By the time your hair grew salt among the black, the villagers could not decide if they pitied you or feared you more. Some brought you small gifts, a pie on Saint's Day, a bottle of cordial at harvest, not bribes, tributes maybe, or thanks they didn't know how to say aloud. You accepted each with the same bowed head. You kept each innocent name carved deep inside, like notches on a bone rosary. Only you would ever pray. And still you climbed the scaffold when called, because someone had to. And better the hand that trembled at night than the hand that never did. If you ask a common villager about an executioner's most guarded secret, they'll guess it's the hidden name behind the hood, or the special prayer whispered before a swing. Fools, all of them. Your greatest secret was the blade. How you loved it, feared it, trusted it more than you trusted your own trembling heart. A blacksmith's hammer sings iron into life, but an executioner's blade breathes in death and carries it, swing by swing, year by year, until even you wonder if the steel remembers every neck it has kissed. Your first axe had belonged to Joran, a squat thing, wide-headed, notched like a beggar's teeth. Joran never sharpened it more than he had to. Rough steel for rough folk, he'd grunt, hacking through bone as if chopping firewood. When he died, whiskey did him in before the plague could. You buried him with that blunt old monster, lodged beside him in the earth so no grave robber could sell it for scrap. After him, you crafted your own. You spent half your year's pay on the blacksmith's forge work, the best steel the village could scrounge from 3 neighbouring towns. You stood beside the forge for days, sweat pooling in your boots, breath tasting of soot and iron. You told the smith exactly how the edge must curve, wide enough to cleave through flesh and bone in one stroke, heavy enough to let its own weight finish what your muscle started, but balanced like a dancer on a tightrope. When he handed it over, still warm from its final quenching, you cradled it like a newborn, a black orphan of iron and ash. It had no name. You never dared give it one. You feared it would answer if you did. Caring for it became your only ritual you trusted more than the church's cold blessings. Every dusk before an execution, you laid it across your lap by the hearth's glow. You dragged a whetstone along the edge in long, patient pulls. Shk, shk. The rhythm calmed you, steadied your heartbeat, drowned out the memory of all the eyes you'd closed forever. Villagers whispered that a good executioner's swing depended on his nerve. You knew better. It depended on the blade. A dull edge betrayed a trembling hand. A nicked edge dragged through sinew instead of slicing clean. And there is no greater horror, no heavier chain on a soul than the crowd's hiss when a neck must feel your mercy twice. The care didn't stop at sharpening. You learned to oil it with a mixture of lard and beeswax, borrowed from the tallow maker at first, later rendered yourself over a low fire when too many folk asked too many questions. In winter, the cold bit steel cruelly made it brittle enough to chip if you swung hard through a frozen bone, so you'd rest the axe near your hearth overnight, warming it like a faithful hound at your feet. When not needed, which was rare, for sin never slept long, you wrapped it in thick canvas and tucked it behind the chest where you kept your few honest treasures. A battered cup your mother once used to pour goat's milk, a hand-carved rosary missing 3 beads, and a letter from a travelling priest who once tried to forgive you for free. Over the years, your blade changed with you. The edge dulled where you'd clipped iron shackles by mistake. The shaft wore smooth under your calloused palms. Once, a desperate condemned man lunged at you mid-swing, a last spark of rage, and your axe's spine caught his collarbone instead of his throat. It left a hairline crack along the grain that you never trusted again. The next day, you traded a month's wages to the blacksmith's son for a new shaft of yew, straighter and stronger than oak, flexible enough to absorb the force without splintering. You realized then that you weren't just a man with a tool. You were caretaker of a companion that demanded more loyalty than any living soul had ever shown you. One autumn night, you awoke to scraping noises outside your window. Moonlight spilled through the shutters in a thin, cold blade of its own. You found a village drunk, half-starved, crouched by your door, your wrapped axe clutched in his filthy hands. He'd thought to sell it for ale and bread. You didn't strike him. You didn't shout. You simply took it back, unwrapped it beneath the moon, and ran your thumb along the edge until it bled, to be certain no fool had chipped it against the cobblestones. He fled into the fields, sobbing curses that your shadow would haunt him forever. Maybe it did. You never cared to know. By your middle years, word had spread through 3 counties that your swing was the truest around. Nobles offered you new blades, gilded, inlaid, even jeweled once, as bribes to travel north or west to perform royal executions when other headsmen bungled their work. You refused every shiny axe. Gilding was for kings and showmen. You were neither. Your steel drank only blood, never pride. Sometimes, as you sat by the embers after a day's grim work, you laid your hand flat on the blade's broad back and whispered to it, half mocking yourself for talking to dead iron. You told it secrets you couldn't tell the priest. You thanked it for sparing your back from the bailiff's whip and your belly from starvation. You promised you'd never leave it rusting in some lord's armoury when you were old and breathless. And you meant it. In your final years, still strong, still steady, young lads apprenticed themselves to you just as you had once to Joran. You made each of them forge their own blade before ever letting them stand near the block. Some learned quickly, some flinched. A few broke entirely, and fled in the night, leaving you to do the work alone. Better that, you thought, than to trust a quivering hand beside yours. When your swing was done at last, when your shoulder ached more than your edge could forgive, you did what Joran could not. You buried your blade yourself. One moonless night you dug the pit behind your crooked shed, wrapped the steel in oiled cloth, and lowered it into the dirt like a father laying his child to rest. No grave marker, no stone, just earth, clean and cold, reclaiming all the sins it once had severed. By the time dawn touched your stooped shoulders, you stood alone by the fresh mound, empty hands trembling, but strangely light. For the first time since boyhood, you felt the weight of the world without the comfort of cold iron to share it. Behind your eyes, the ghosts still lined up, waiting for you to remember each neck, each prayer, each whisper before the hush. But your blade, it slept, buried deep, where no drunk, no thief, no trembling apprentice would ever disturb its secrets again. Time does strange things to a man who lives by the swing. Your shoulder stiffens where once it coiled like rope. Your eyes blur when you squint at the block in dawn's watery light. Your back aches so deeply you half expect the church bell to toll for you before it does for the man kneeling in your shadow. But age is no mercy, not for an executioner. You can stop tending chickens, you can stop mending boots, but no village lord wants to hear you've retired from fear itself. So you endure, and the townsfolk look at you with two faces. One is gratitude for the years you kept the drunkard, the brigand, the traitor at bay. The other is quiet dread that someday you'll swing for one of them by mistake, or not swing at all and leave the law to wolves. The rumour began on a frostbitten winter market day. You were too old. Your blade arm, once a lever of iron, now trembled like a child's cough in the cold. The baker's boy told the smith's wife, who told the barmaid, who told everyone who'd listen, that the hooded butcher's next swing would be crooked, that the next neck would not part clean. You heard it all. In mutters at the well, in nervous laughter behind your back when you traded copper for a hunk of salted pork. You kept your hood pulled low and your mouth shut. Let them talk. Better a trembling old butcher than a drunk young one who botched the whole scaffold and made the people riot. Then came the letter, sealed in red wax you'd learned to hate. The Baron's mark pressed into the wax like a brand on cattle. Summons, simple and short. An execution at dawn, 3 days hence. But not for a petty pickpocket or a cow thief. Not even for a debt-logged farmhand. This was for an outlaw. A woodsman turned murderer who'd ambushed a royal courier and left his bones in a ditch. The crown wanted his head, and the Baron wanted a message. Even wolves in the forest fear the headsman's axe. You prepared the only way you knew, sharpened your blade till the whetstones squealed, oiled the shaft until it gleamed dark in firelight, flexed your shoulder each night under your threadbare cloak. You did not pray. The saints knew your voice too well by now. They had stopped listening the moment your swing earned coin. Dawn came all knives and breath clouds. Frost sheathed the scaffold steps so thick the bailiff cursed and nearly slipped hauling the outlaw up by a hemp rope. The condemned man laughed, a hoarse bark that sent 2 women scurrying back into the crowd. You climbed after them, boots crunching, joints creaking louder than the timber beneath you. You planted your feet. You checked your blade's edge one last time, just as you always had, since boyhood. You did not look at the outlaw's face. You never did anymore. When the hush settled over the square, you let your eyes drift to the rooftops, rimed with white, the distant church steeple stabbing the pale sky. A magpie called once, twice, a scavenger waiting for scraps. You inhaled iron, hay, stale breath, snow. You exhaled. The outlaw cursed you under his breath. The priest droned a half-hearted blessing. And then you lifted the blade. Your shoulder screamed a quiet warning. Your elbow groaned as if a rusty hinge swung your whole arm. For one heartbeat, your vision doubled. 2 blocks, 2 kneeling men, 2 crowds. You pressed your heel into the frozen plank until pain jolted you steady. And then you swung. The crack split the morning like thunder. Clean, swift. The outlaw's head fell into the straw basket. Blood hissed over the block, steam rising as if you'd poured boiling water onto a frozen log. The hush cracked too, into nervous cheers, muttered prayers, and the bailiff's barking command to clear the square before the bodies stiffened. You stood there alone on the planks while the crowd drained away, step by step, a living tide washing your sins off their boots. Later, you sat by your hearth, blade across your knees, fingers tracing the fresh nick where steel had kissed bone. Your arm throbbed deep in the marrow, no salve strong enough to soothe it. You knew then, this was the last. Your swing was still true. But next time, there would be no true. There would be no next. You would not stand trembling like a fool and shame the steel that had never failed you. You rose slowly, boots whispering over rushes scattered to hide the smell of old blood. You wrapped the axe in its oiled cloth, hands gentle as a father, tucking in a sleeping child. You thought of Joran, grunting at you through yellowed teeth. One day the axe tires of your hand, boy. It tells you when to rest, listen or die a fool. You had listened. In the days that followed, you told no one. Let them guess. Let them whisper that the old headsman had died in his bed, choked on ale, wandered into the forest to find peace with the wolves he'd outlived. You dug deep behind your shed where the earth still remembered your secrets. You laid the axe there, heavy and cold in the pit you'd carved bare-handed. You pressed dirt over steel and whispered your thanks. For clean swings, for steady nights, for mercy, when mercy could find room between law and iron. Some say an executioner dies twice, once when his heart stops, and once when the village forgets his name. You never cared for immortality carved in stone. You cared only that the final swing was true. And so, when the new man came to claim the hood, a young fellow with soft hands and a thin voice, trembling before the block that had swallowed your youth, you gave him no advice, no blessing, no curse. You simply pressed the old leather hood into his palm, turned your back, and left him alone with the crowd's hush, the weight of secrets, and the cold bite of dawn waiting to test his nerve. When the hood passed from your weathered hands into the young man's, you felt a strange emptiness, like the hearth's last ember fading into cold ash. You walked away from the scaffold for the final time, but you did not walk away from the weight of your years, the memories that clung to you like smoke to damp clothes. The crowd never sees the ghosts. They only see the black hooded figure swinging the blade, the sharp crack echoing over the marketplace, the sudden hush afterward. But the ghosts? They linger long after the crowd has dispersed, long after the sun has set and the shadows have swallowed the gallows. You remember the first ghost you ever saw. You were a boy then, standing behind Joran as he hefted the axe above a trembling neck. The condemned man was a farmer, accused of stealing grain in a bad year. The crowd howled for blood, but the man's eyes were full of despair, not hate. When the axe fell, you swear you saw a flicker, a shimmer of a man's life peeling away like smoke curling from a dying fire. That night, when the village was silent and cold pressed against the windows, you dreamed of that man, his voice a soft whisper calling your name. Over the years, the ghosts multiplied. They came with the wind, riding on whispers in the chapel, lurking beneath your door at night, sitting silently on the edge of your bed. Some were angry, furious at their fate, their voices rising in silent screams that rattled your bones. Others were sorrowful, mourning the lives they never lived, the songs never sung, the hands never held. And then there were the quiet ones, those who forgave you, who understood you were but a tool of fate, a keeper of grim contracts written long before you were born. The hardest ghost was never the guilty or even the innocent condemned. It was the child, a tiny wretch caught stealing a loaf of bread, eyes wide with hunger and fear. You swung, and the crowd gasped, but the child's eyes never closed. They followed you home. You saw him every night, shivering beneath a thin blanket, reaching for a mother who was gone, whispering a name you never knew. Sometimes the ghosts came to life in the day. The tavern keeper's wife who looked away when you passed, the blacksmith's son who flinched at your shadow, the farmer's wife who touched her child's cheek a little too tightly as you passed by. You knew you were both feared and pitied. The village's necessary evil, a grim guardian standing between order and chaos. In the quiet moments, when the world was still and the wind was low, you would take off the hood and sit beneath the stars. You'd trace the constellations, wondering if the souls you sent on their way found peace among those distant fires. You imagined a field where ghosts danced in the moonlight, no longer bound by chains or fear, free to whisper stories to each other beyond the reach of earth and steel. One night, a stranger came to your door, cloaked, silent, with eyes too knowing for comfort. He handed you a small box, carved from dark wood, inlaid with silver runes. Inside lay a token, a simple, unadorned ring. "Wear this," the stranger said, voice like gravel, "and may it guard you from the ghosts that haunt the living." You accepted, but you did not wear it. You placed it beside your bed, where it caught the candlelight like a promise you could not keep. Years passed. The young executioner learned the trade. Clumsy at first, then steady, then feared in his own right. You watched from afar, shadows lengthening, knowing the hood was no longer yours. But the ghosts never left. They came when you were alone, whispering, reminding, mourning. A reminder that no matter how many heads fell, no matter how many lives ended, death was never tidy or just. And so you lived your days in quiet, carrying the weight of those you sent beyond the veil, the whisper of steel in your ears, the ghosts forever at your side. You never spoke of it. No one would understand. But tonight, as the fire dies down and the wind hums softly, maybe you'll listen. Maybe, just maybe, the ghosts have a story to tell you yet. Tonight, before you close your eyes and slip into dreams, I want to tell you a story no one in the village dared whisper aloud. The story of the executioner who once showed mercy. It began on a chilled autumn evening, the kind where the wind carries the scent of rotting leaves and smoke from distant hearths. You had returned from the day's grim work, your cloak heavy with the damp cold and the weight of lives ended before dawn. The village was quiet, the streets empty, but for stray cats slinking between shadows. As you passed the tavern, you heard a soft, trembling voice, curious, or maybe simply tired of silence. You stopped. At the doorstep, wrapped in threadbare rags, sat a boy no older than 10. His eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting the flickering torchlight like two frightened birds. The boy's name was Thomas. He was no criminal, just a runaway from a cruel master, a child who knew hunger better than kindness. His small fingers clutched a stolen loaf of bread, his legs shaking from cold and fear. Most would have turned away. The law was clear. Theft was theft, and punishment swift. But you saw something different that night. Not a thief, but a child lost and desperate. You did what few would dare. You knelt beside him, offering your worn glove. "Come," you said softly, voice rough but steady. "There's more to life than running in shadows." You took Thomas back to your humble home, sharing what little food you had. Over weeks, the boy learned to speak without fear, to laugh without trembling, and slowly, you learned to soften beneath the heavy hood you wore for the world. Word spread quickly that the executioner kept a boy at his side. Whispers turned to rumors. Some called it madness, others called it mercy. The village children, who once scattered at your approach, now sometimes lingered near your door, drawn by the quiet laughter and the scent of fresh bread. But mercy did not come without price. One bitter winter's night, a crime shattered the fragile peace. A local lord's prized horse was stolen, and suspicion quickly fell on Tomas. The boy was dragged before you, eyes wild with panic, voice trembling as he denied the charge. The village's whispers turned to howls. Executioner's boy, they spat. A thief's son. Your heart clenched. The law was merciless, but you knew Thomas's truth better than anyone. The trial was swift. The bailiff demanded justice. The crowd clamored for blood. You stood silent, the weight of your hood heavier than ever. When the moment came to swing the blade, you hesitated. Just a fraction, but enough. You looked into Thomas's eyes, saw the boy who had learned to trust, to hope. You made a choice. Instead of lifting the axe, you stepped down, voice booming through the square. This boy is innocent. The true thief hides behind lies and greed. The crowd gasped, but you held your ground. You sent guards to find the real culprit, a bitter stable hand who confessed under pressure, cursing the executioner's mercy even as he was dragged away. That night, Tomas slept soundly for the first time in months, and you, beneath your hood, felt a warmth you hadn't known was possible, the warmth of hope, fragile but real. In the years that followed, Thomas grew strong and kind, his laughter ringing through the village like a blessing. The executioner's shadow softened, touched by the light a single act of mercy can bring. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, let this story remind you that even in the darkest times, there is room for kindness, for grace, for hope. Rest easy now. Let the quiet hush of night wrap around you like a soft cloak. Breathe deeply, slowly, and know that mercy lives, sometimes where you least expect it.